All right, so let's go back to our budget then.
Wait, what happens after they make the budget and say, like, something catastrophic happens, so they need more money, and it's not in the budget? What do they do? Like, if say, like, okay, we had $200 for this, but now we need more. Is there a process for that?
There is. And so I'm almost there. Thank you for saying that, though, so I'll show you right now. Okay, so once they do that, once they've got the money allocated, there's this little bitty time period where they can do something called reconciliation. And I didn't put this in your vocab words. I'm just telling you this as a future voter, okay? Reconciliation is a last minute, or maybe I did put it in there, I'm not sure. Reconciliation is a last minute, like, okay, we got a little bit more information and we need to make an amendment to what we had previously said before. So reconciliation is going to bypass committees, and it's something that's just going to be done like right at the end on the floor. In the last couple years, they've done that to push through controversial legislation. Like part of the Obamacare legislation was done through the reconciliation process. That was not what it was intended for, but it's kind of like a loophole, and so that is something you should kind of pay attention to, because that could be a way. Can you imagine why somebody might agree to something during reconciliation that they didn't agree to in a committee? Yeah, it's the same idea as why would you agree to pork if you don't agree with pork? It's because you're at the very end there, you're so close, and sometimes we're just willing to give in to things, and not as many hands are going to touch it. You know, there's not the same opportunity for debate. All right, so then we get to October 1st. If by October 1st, money has not been allocated, so we haven't passed those different appropriations bills, then that's when the government shuts down. So you guys have heard about that in the last couple of years. So if we get to October 1st and, like, let's say they haven't passed the defense bill, then all non-essential defense spending has not been allocated. There's not money to turn on the lights. So if you work in payroll for the defense industry, you don't get to go to work that day. If you work in a civilian position for the defense industry and you're not vital to protecting American lives, you're not going to work that day. So military schools, they're going to be closed, museums, etc., all of that kind of stuff. So what happens a lot of times is if we get to October 1st and they haven't passed it, they can pass something called a continuing resolution. Continuing resolution says, for the next 30 days, we have to spend money the way we previously had. So we didn't do our job, we didn't get the budget done like we were supposed to, so we're going to extend this process by 30 days. I've seen years where they've passed as many as 5 continuing resolutions on different parts of the budget. As far as I know, and I would even say this on Jeopardy, I'm not pretty confident, since this process was created, we have never made it where we didn't have to pass at least one continuing resolution. So while October 1st is the deadline, they've never actually made it completely to the deadline. Yes, ma'am?
Is it like, if you have like a defense budget and like an education, like you have to have both of those done by that time, or is it just one that has to be done and then another?
They can just do continuing resolutions for the portion that didn't get done.
Oh.
Yeah, and the other one will take place. That was a really good question.
So does that mean the government shuts down every time that this happens, or do they pass the continuation before this happens? Like the government?
They sometimes pass it before. Yeah, because if it gets to the shutdown, then we've got a problem. But it has definitely been like a game of chicken in a lot of ways, where they get to the very end right there and they pass a continuing resolution like the night before the shutdown. And then sometimes they just get there. Okay, so let's say that they do get the money allocated, or, you know, for whatever reason we finally get the budget done. So Annalise asked a really good question. What if something happens and they need to change? Well, they can't. So you have a final card there on your desk where it says GAO, right? The GAO is again part of Congress, and their job is to perform legislative oversight. So as the budget's being implemented, members of the bureaucracy that are spending money might have to come in and testify before Congress and talk about how they're spending money. And if we have a situation where there's a crisis like a natural disaster and we don't have enough money for FEMA, then we can take money from one area and reroute it to another area. That's always a possibility. I had a professor in college for my statistics class, and he was retired from NASA. He was so fun. He was such a great professor. And he was a young man to be retired, but he said the reason he left NASA is because everything that they do is dependent on federal funding, or it was at the time. and they would be working on a project, and in the middle of the project they would frequently lose their funding because the GAO can take their money away and they could reroute it to somebody else because NASA is not essential. I mean, there's parts that would, I guess if you space station, people in space kind of thing, but beyond that, like what NASA does doesn't have to be done, but we do have to take care of people when a tornado has come through and like knocked down all the buildings, right? So getting the money is not a guarantee that you're going to keep the money. Getting the money is not a guarantee that you're not going to get more money should something happen. And that can also be politically motivated as well. It doesn't have to be just emergency. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, well, there's also just like federal grants for like, it says for NASA, but like for other sciencey things. Like, so do they take away money from like the big stuff, or do they like kind of take away from the smaller stuff for?
It could be anything. I mean, it could just be. It depends on what they need. And I mean, they plan for that. I mean, they plan for like disaster preparedness and things like that. But sometimes things happen. Like 9/11.
Do they take a little bit from everyone, or do they take like specifically target one thing that's like the least important?
Well, I'm actually going to show you a picture of the budget and show you there's not a lot of areas they can take from.
Okay.
And so they're probably going to have. It just depends on how much they need. All right. So let me show you why we have this process. Right? Always the answer. So in 1974, Congress passed a law called the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act as a result of the actions of this man. So this process right here was created because of his actions. So if Congress is in charge of the money, they pass the law, that money goes to the executive branch, and then they have to enforce the law, which means they spend the money. So President Nixon didn't like how Congress had authorized funds and allocated them the way Congress had allocated it. And that's called impoundment, refusing to spend the money the way Congress has allocated it. So in 1974, they passed a law which created this process, said the president has to write a budget and tell them what he wants, but then they create it, and now the president can no longer do that. So the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act changed this process and really reasserted Congress's authority in a lot of ways. And it definitely kind of upped the ante in terms of making Congress even more influential, because the president really can't do that anymore because of the law. Right? It's a very flattering picture, isn't it? Okay, so Annalise just asked about this, about like in terms of like where would they take the money from. So let's look at this one first. Okay? So I know this picture isn't fantastic. It is in your textbook. I just tried to blow it up a little bit. But this is basically what our budget looks like. Okay? Percentage-wise, 34% of the money that was allocated in last year's budget went for Social Security and to pay for people that are on unemployment. Right? Do we get to decide yearly how much money we're going to pay for Social Security?
No.
Right.
They do.
Right. Well, does anybody though? Like what determines whether or not you're going to get Social Security? Do you know?
Funds.
Age, people retired, funds. Okay. Okay. We refer to that kind of program as an entitlement program. If you have paid into Social Security for 40 quarters and you reach the age of eligibility, you are guaranteed Social Security. If we have a bad economic year and the government doesn't make a lot of money, you're still guaranteed Social Security. If you are a person who is disabled and you meet the eligibility requirements to take Social Security, you are entitled to it regardless of how much money we have. And truth be told, more people will qualify for it during a bad time than during a good time, because some like unemployment and other things that go along with it. The same is true for Medicare and other health payments. In a bad economic time, we're going to spend more on Medicare. If you reach the age of 65, you are entitled to Medicare, right? And so as a result, if you guys look at that, 58% of our budget is something that we can't change. Like we are required to pay that unless we change the program. So that's like mandatory expenditures. 7% of what we spent was interest on the debt. And we'll talk about that in just a second, but the debt, like just the accumulation of the money that we owe from previous budgets. So the bigger the debt gets, what happens to that piece of pie?
It gets bigger.
Right? So you guys understand that, right? Like if your debt is larger, then your interest is also larger because you had to take out more money to pay it back. So this gets bigger, this gets bigger, this gets bigger. Military spending is not mandatory mostly. Some of it is, but 18% of our budget was spent on the military. We spent 4% on food and agriculture. We spent 2% on education. We spent, I think that's 0.5% on energy and the environment. We spent 1% on international affairs. These things are your discretionary spending. Those are the things you actually get to choose to spend on. So when politicians tell you, oh, we're going to create this program or we're going to do this, those are the choice things, but look, it doesn't actually make up a huge portion of what we really do. Unless, of course, we change those programs, and then that would be different. Okay. All right, now let's look at this one. Where do we get our money? Congress is also in charge of setting the tax rate, right? Do you remember what committee in the House is? I'll jump up and down. I'll be so excited.
Wait, what was the question?
Which committee sets the tax rates? The
Rules
House
of Committee.
Ways and
The House Rules.
no jumping up and down for me today.
I thought the House rules.
Mm-mm. The House Ways and Means Committee. There was a little video last class on them. All right, so the House Ways and Means Committee they set the tax rate, okay? I want to show you kind of like where we get our money because, again, this is a very political thing. You're going to hear politicians talk about taxes until you just want to shoot yourself, right? Okay, so right here, 47% of the money that we took in from our last budget came from income taxes. We have not always had an income tax. You learned last year in U.S. history, and there's a card on your desk. What created the federal income tax? It's on your desk. Yay, say it louder. The 16th Amendment created the individual income tax. Okay, let's try to jog your memories a little bit. I know you had good U.S. history teachers. So the 16th Amendment was passed during the Progressive Era. Who were we trying to protect a lot during the Progressive Era? Like what kind of people? We were trying to protect like workers. We had this emergence of this middle class, right? Remember that like we had programs that attacked wealthy people, got rid of monopolies, things like that. So who do you think the individual income tax is supposed to have a greater, put a greater burden on? Wealthy people, very good. And we refer to our income tax as a progressive income tax. So what that means is your income is affected based on how much money you make. So those of you that had jobs, when you filed taxes, did you get your money back?
Yeah.
No? Some of you did, some of you didn't?
I did.
Okay.
I filed zero.
You got zero money?
No, I filed the zero.
Right, zero.
I get money back.
Awesome, right? You absolutely do. Because you're a dependent of your parents, right? Okay, and so I'm going to guess that your income wasn't super high, right? Because you don't support yourself, and so you get that money back. Well, even if Brennan was took care of himself and still didn't make that much money, he might, even if he was a dependent of himself, he still might not have to pay taxes. So what we do is we take into consideration how much money you make, and as your income goes up, your tax percentage will go up. So people that make, say, $20,000 a year might pay 0% of their income into tax, for income tax. And then people that make $200,000 might pay, say, 20%, and then so on. I don't know the exact percentages, but the percentages will rise and rise and rise up to a maximum. So our individual income tax is like that, and our corporate income tax is like that as well. So the more earnings that your company makes, the higher their percentage of tax will be. It's a little bit deceiving though, because, and I want you to pay attention to this one as well as a voter, politicians will tell you that we need to get rid of tax loopholes. What would a loophole be, do you think? What does that word mean, loophole?
Getting out of it.
Yeah, it's like a way around something, right? So there are lots of things in the tax code that allow you to lower your tax rate. So if you bought energy efficient improvements to your home, you would get a tax deduction. If you sold stock